It's lovely to be here. Thank you for having me. What I wanted to do with my brief time with you is really to try and offer a way of seeing the moment in time that we're living in through the lens of the stories that I work with, the idea of people as citizens. And really the spirit of this is the best advice I was ever given by my driving instructor when I was 17. And he said, what you've got to remember is that you should always stare at the road you want to drive on and not at the truck you don't want to drive into. So I offer you that as the sort of spirit of this talk. So where I want to begin to share this idea of seeing the moment in time through the lens of story is to take you back to March 2020, to when the pandemic began, to when we were all doing it, right? Because I don't know about you, where I live, I got a viral kindness postcard through my letterbox on the Saturday, the 14th of March, and it offered me help if I was isolating and gave me a name and address. And then I went online and I found that there were mutual aid groups already springing up. This is 10 days before any announcement of lockdown, remember? Like this, we were doing it. And then a little bit after that, my local council started getting involved, and they were offering certification, like validating people's addresses so that you knew what you were doing. And then I found out later that they were starting to arrange in local hubs and kind of like we were doing it, right? We were doing this community power thing. And then came May the 10th, and the message changed. And I want to just step back here and tell you the three stories that I work with, and then come back to that moment and explain why I think that moment was so significant. So going back to the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, my argument is that the story of the individual in society was something like the subject. The right thing for us to do was to keep our heads down, do as we were told, get what we were given, on the basis that the God-given few who run society know best, and they'll lead us to the best outcomes for society as a whole. And that story kind of collapsed and fell in on itself. The rise of the middle class, the Industrial Revolution, you just couldn't sustain that kind of logic anymore. And out of the two world wars, we got a very different story. We got what I call the consumer story. And in the consumer story, the right thing to do is to get the best deal for yourself, to look out for number one, to choose the option that suits you best from those that are offered, on the basis that individual self-interest will add up to collective interest. It's another hypothesis for how the best society will result. What I believe is happening right now is that we're living in the collapse of that story, just as the subject story fell apart before it. That logic is riven with its own contradictions, that we're in a moment of climate emergency, ecological collapse, and telling ourselves a story that says that our only contribution to that is to turn our washing machines down and choose between slightly more ethical products. We're living in a moment of massive inequality and telling ourselves a story that says that society is a ladder that we should be climbing. We're living in a moment of loneliness and isolation and telling ourselves a story that says that we're isolated individuals, right? And so it just can't hold. And what's emerging, what's taking shape, what we were doing, and what's happening all over the world and in every sector actually, is what I call the citizen story. And the citizen story says the right thing to do is to get involved, to share your ideas, energy, and resources to the search for the best society as a whole. Because all of us are smarter than any of us, right? And if we tap into those ideas, energy, and resources, if organizations and institutions encourage the sharing of those ideas, energy, and resources, create the structures that make it joyful and meaningful to do it, then that is how we'll get to the best society. It's happening. We were doing it. And then May the 10th, right? So the message at that time was stay home, protect the NHS, save lives. And that was a subject story message, really. Like, we needed it, fair, whatever. But it was a message that was straight out of that idea of do as you're told. Protection in return for obedience is the eternal bargain of the subject story. I go right back to King Sargon of Akkad in 2500 BC in the book to develop these ideas of paternalism that are in that story. But that story was falling apart because we were doing it. And we didn't need that protection, and it wasn't working anyway. But the change that came was to stay alert. Individual responsibility. Go back to seeking the best deal for yourself. Councils, go back to providing services. And I want to be really clear here that I'm not making a party political point to the panel you've just heard. Like, I'm not sure anyone really in the positions that we need them to be in is seeing this story for what it could be and how it could work. But we were doing it. And if we could have, just imagine if in that moment there could have been a message that said, let's get through this together, let's do this together because we're doing it. And imagine if they'd set up a phone line where any citizen could ring in with ideas for how the country's response could be better, because that happened in Taiwan. And I'm going to interview Audrey Tang for you guys tomorrow morning, and you'll hear more about that. Imagine if we'd set up citizens' assemblies to help us understand and design the transition to a kind of COVID-safe, COVID-friendly, post-COVID society. If we'd involved people in that. Imagine if councils had been properly funded and supported to understand what they had been doing out of necessity and with no resources, and then do it deliberately and consciously and be place-based workers and put community connectors who have been the sort of outreach people in the third lines bang in the center, because that's what we were doing. Imagine if, right? But it's no use going to the what ifs. For all that thought experiment is useful, we are where we are, and there are plenty of crises coming down the track. But what we've got to remember, I think, is that this is who we are. It's not just what we were doing. It's who we are as citizens. And if we can lean into that and start from there as we design what we do next and we start to build the intention, I think councils, particularly those of you who work in those organizations, and I know that's many in the room, are absolutely vital in that. Because as individuals, we've got to keep coming. Those of us who are still involved in those mutual aid groups and those local networks and those community organizations, and they are everywhere, have got to keep coming and keep doing it and keep working and not lose the faith and the belief in that as important work. And we need national politics to change, right? Like, don't get me wrong, we do. We need a Community Power Act. We need that sort of change to happen so that the space is made for this. But councils have massive agency in this moment in time, because we can start to build a new story. We can start to challenge our own ideas of who we are and who people are and relate differently. We can challenge our language. We can look at it and say, really, are we service providers? Is that who we want to be? Because providing services feels awfully consumer story to me. And what we were doing in that moment in time was much more enabling, was much more kind of creating the space, convening, connecting, making it happen. We can pay attention to how we measure success. And think about, as we've been doing some work with Kirklees Council on, like, what if you measured the extent to which people feel they have agency rather than just measuring efficient and effective delivery, because that traps us in that service provider model. We can do that work of revisiting our measures. We can do the work of paying attention to our language. But most fundamentally, we can pay attention to who people are and the story we tell ourselves about the people in communities and the people around us. And fundamentally, what the citizen story comes down to is starting with a very simple question. What would you do if you truly believed in people? And that's where I'll leave you. Thanks for having me.